How do communities and ecosystems respond to changing environments? A term you should be familiar with is ecological succession. This is the normal gradual change in species composition in a given geographic area in response to changing environmental conditions. We break ecological succession into two types: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession, depicted on the left corner of your screen, is the gradual establishment of biotic communities in lifeless areas where there is no soil in a terrestrial ecosystem or no bottom sediment in an aquatic system. So primary ecological succession can take hundreds to thousands of years. A good example of where this would occur is when a glacier retreats back up the valley to where it originally starts. And as it retreats, it exposes a lot of barren rock material without having soil and nutrients present. So over time, you would see lichens and mosses start to grow, then small herbs and shrubs, and then more plants and biodiversity would occur over hundreds and thousands of years. On the right side of the screen is an example of secondary succession, and this occurs when communities or ecosystems have been disturbed, removed, or destroyed, but they do retain some of their sediment or soil properties. As a result, the succession occurs in a shorter time frame in secondary succession as opposed to primary succession, and that's because there's soils and sediments already existent for which plants can grow in. A good example of this would be the natural restoration of disturbed land on an old abandoned farm field. It could take 150 to 200 years after the farmland was abandoned for it to become completely forested with mature oak and hickory trees. But that is a much shorter time frame than the primary succession that would occur from a glacial retreat. Constant change occurs within living systems. And that's because there's so many complex processes that occur with interactions. We will discuss the stability and sustainability of ecosystems in response to change. Ecosystems can withstand external stress as a result of changing environmental conditions based on their inertia or persistence and their resilience. The inertia or persistence is the ability of an ecosystem to survive moderate disturbances. The resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to be restored through secondary ecological succession after a more severe disturbance. Tropical rainforests have high inertia and thus resistant to lower levels of change or damage because of their high species diversity. However, if a large tract of tropical rainforest is cleared or severely damaged, the resilience of the resulting degraded forest ecosystem may be so low that it reaches an ecological tipping point after which it cannot be restored via secondary ecological succession. One reason for this is because most of the nutrients in a tropical rainforest are stored in its vegetation, not in the topsoil. So once the nutrient-rich vegetation is gone, the daily rains can remove most of the remaining soil nutrients and thus prevent the return of a tropical rainforest on large cleared areas. Hence, it's important to protect our rainforests because they do not regrow quickly. Grasslands are less diverse than tropical rainforests and they have low inertia, just the opposite of a tropical rainforest. Most of their plant matter is stored in underground roots, so these ecosystems have a high resilience and can recover quickly after a fire as their roots produce more new grasses. However, grasslands can be destroyed if its roots are plowed up or something else is planted in its place, or if it's severely overgrazed. But for the most part, grasslands represent an ecosystem that has a greater resilience than that of a tropical rainforest. And just the reverse of that is true in regards to inertia. Tropical rainforests have a higher inertia, and grasslands have a lower inertia. So, we've talked about species and ecosystems and relationships between species. What limits the growth of populations? Well, the biotic potential and intrinsic rate of increase are two terms that you should know. Biotic potential is the idealized capacity for growth within an ecosystem, and the intrinsic rate of increase is that nature limits the population growth because the resource limits and competition. To summarize population growth, no population can continue to grow indefinitely because there's limitations on resources and because there's competition among species for those resources. Now, each species within an ecosystem does have a range of tolerance, or its ability to survive under various specific physical and chemical and environmental conditions. Some individuals in a population may also have different range of tolerances for temperature or other physical chemical factors. These are known as limiting factors. So, for example, on land, precipitation could be a limiting factor. So, frogs like to live in very wet conditions, and salamanders, and if there's a lack of rainfall in a particular area, then it's likely that you're not going to have an abundance of frogs and salamanders living there. In aquatic ecosystems, limiting factors can be temperature, water depth, clarity in terms of sunlight penetrating the water, nutrient availability, acidity, salinity, and dissolved oxygen. In addition to having too few of a limiting factor, or being on the brink of the range of tolerance of a limiting factor, you can have too much of a limiting factor as well. Too much water on land or too much acidity in aquatic environments can impact the types of species that live there. This diagram is depicting a range of tolerance for a fish species. It's showing low temperature, medium temperature, and high temperature on the x-axis, and the number of organisms with the red curve as well. And it's also breaking it down that no organisms or fish are going to live in the zone of intolerance where the temperature is too cold. Then there's few organisms living in this zone of physiological stress where it's moderately cold. The abundance of organisms is in the optimal range of temperature for this particular fish species, and as the temperature gets warmer, there's a zone of physiological stress where few organisms will live. And then finally, an area where no organisms live because it's too hot in terms of temperature. We often refer to the range of tolerance as having a lower limit of tolerance and a higher limit of tolerance, and an actual value could be specified for temperature or dissolved oxygen content or nitrogen concentration or water depth and so on. So let's shift into talking about species reproductive patterns. On this table I have a column for K selected species and a column for R selected species and the different traits associated with them. R selected species have a capacity for a high rate of population increase. They typically have short lifespans, but they also have a short time to reproductive maturity. They can usually have many offsprings. They also do not take care of their offspring. So insects would be an example of this. Butterflies. The population growth rate can be fast, and they tend to have density as population regulation. Examples would be oysters, insects, and even a plant that you may be familiar with, the goldenrod. These species tend to be opportunists. This column refers to the K-selected species, and these species have a longer lifespan, and they typically have to be several years old before they can reproduce. I mentioned earlier with the American alligator that the American alligator needs to be between 8 to 13 years old before it can reproduce. They have few reproductive events in their lifetime, and they have few offspring. Their offspring are typically large, and they typically stick around and raise the offspring as parents. Examples of K-selected species would include lemurs, bats, elephants, giraffes, grizzly bears, and wolves. Most species have reproductive patterns somewhere between the extremes of the R-selected species and the K-selected species. Most large mammals are K-selected species, and if a K-selected species has a low reproductive rate, they may be vulnerable to extinction. Elephants and whales, birds of prey, tropical rainforest trees, sharks, giant redwood trees, and the Southern California sea otter are species that fall in the K-selected species category, and their population numbers have been impacted. Let's look at the redwood trees. There are three types of redwood trees, and they are the coastal redwoods, the giant sequoia, and the dawn redwoods. Coastal redwoods are actually the tallest of trees that reach heights of more than 350 feet. The tallest tree in the world is named Hyperion, and it reaches 380 feet tall. Redwoods can actually achieve a diameter of about 24 feet, and they can weigh over 1.6 million pounds. These giants can live up to be 2,000 years old and have graced the planet for more than 240 million years. Though they once thrived through much of the northern hemisphere, today redwoods are only found on the coast from central California through southern Oregon. They do not live more than 50 miles inland and are usually found in long belts rather than small groves. The dawn redwood that was mentioned earlier lives in China and is native to China. Interestingly, redwoods themselves are not considered threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Despite the fact that only 5% of the original ancient redwood forest remains today, there are still 1.5 million acres of young forest, meaning that as the species of redwoods are in no real danger. However, the forest does not benefit tremendously from this law. One of the most wide-reaching aspects of ESA is to mandate not only to protect individual species, but the ecosystem on which they depend. So it's a commitment that allows for endangered species habitat and not just the plants or animals themselves to be protected. So ancient redwoods may not be considered as endangered, but the forest is more than just trees within it. And old-growth forests are critical habitat for many other species under the Endangered Species Act, including the spotted owls, marbled murrelets, the steelhead trout, and coho salmon, to name just but a few. So by protecting these species and the places they need, the forest itself has actually been spared many times over. Another type of redwood is the giant sequoia tree. These trees live in old-growth forest in the Sierra Mountains in California. To succeed, these trees have to compete for light, and they grow very tall, and they develop an extensive root system and live a really long lifetime, up to 3,000 years. These trees don't start to reproduce until they're about 150 to 200 years old. That's when they release thousands of seeds from pine cones. The seeds need to escape their seed coat, and they land on bare soil with enough moisture and sunlight in order for them to germinate and grow. This is actually a picture of me, your professor, hugging a giant sequoia tree in California. It's an amazing place to visit, and I highly recommend that you visit Yosemite National Park to see the redwoods and Sequoia National Park to see the giant sequoias. So the giant sequoias have a very specific climate requirement where they're very limited in where they can grow. They need to be at an elevation of about 5,000 to 7,000 feet and grow in a very narrow strip along the Sierra Mountains in California. As mentioned earlier, they can live up to be 3,000 years old, and some branches can be up to 8 feet in diameter. The bark can be about 3 feet thick, and this helps protect it against forest fires in the region. Giant sequoias are actually not good for lumber, which has helped retain this tree in the groves that are present in California. This is me pictured in front of the General Sherman tree in Sequoia National Park. General Sherman is the largest living tree. It's over 2,100 years old and 275 feet tall. There is concern in regards to climate change impact on these trees, and research is currently being done. In addition, it's worth noting that these trees have been protected from logging for over 100 years thanks to President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1991, it even became illegal to harvest a fallen giant sequoia tree. So these trees are definitely protected.